Snow howled through the trees, a cold wind slashing against Eleanor Whitmore's face as she ran. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her boots slipping on the frozen earth beneath her. The moon, a thin silver scythe in the sky, cast eerie shadows across the skeletal trees. Behind her, the sound of men crashing through the underbrush spurred her forward. They were close. Too close. She swallowed back a sob, her body screaming for rest, but there was no stopping, not if she wanted to live. A gunshot split the air. Bark exploded from a tree inches from her head. A warning. They were playing with her, letting her think she could get away. Her foot caught on an exposed root, and she crashed onto the icy ground. Pain flared in her palms as they scraped against the frozen dirt. She pushed herself up, her vision blurring from exhaustion. Another gunshot rang out, and this time, it wasn't a warning. The forest swallowed the sound, and for a moment the world stilled. Then a voice, low, measured, dangerous, cut through the cold. "You boys are trespassing." Eleanor's pulse hammered as she lifted her head. A man stood in the clearing, a rifle steady against his shoulder. He was tall, broad, his coat heavy with snow. A shadow against the storm. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a hat, but she could see the gleam of his eyes, calm, assessing. The men who had been chasing her halted. One of them, a wiry man with a scar down his cheek, lifted his pistol. "This ain't your business, Boone." Boone. The name sent a chill through Eleanor, one colder than the wind. "I make it my business when cowards hunt a woman like a damn animal." His voice carried no heat, no emotion. Just fact. Scarcheek sneered. "She's got a debt to pay." "Not anymore." Boone shifted the rifle ever so slightly. The air thickened, tense and expectant. Eleanor barely breathed. Then, without warning, Boone fired. The shot was deafening, its echo rolling through the valley. One of the men stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, a curse ripping from his throat. "Get the hell out of here," Boone said, voice like iron. Scarcheek hesitated, rage warring with caution. Then, with a hiss of breath, he grabbed his wounded companion and disappeared into the trees. The others followed. Eleanor remained where she had fallen, her chest heaving. Her body felt separate from her, weightless, like she was still running, still caught in the moment before the gunshot. Boots crunched against the snow. She flinched when the man crouched beside her. Up close, she could see the lines etched into his weathered face, the hint of something unreadable in his sharp blue eyes. "You hurt?" he asked. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. She wasn't sure if she was hurt. Everything felt numb. "Can you stand?" She nodded but made no move to rise. He sighed, then, without another word, slid his arms beneath her and lifted her effortlessly. Eleanor stiffened. "Put me down." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "You're half frozen." The argument died on her lips as exhaustion dragged her under. When she next opened her eyes, she was warm. Blinking against the soft flicker of firelight she took in her surroundings. A cabin. Rough-hewn logs made up the walls, the scent of pine and smoke thick in the air. The blanket draped over her was coarse but heavy, trapping heat against her chilled skin. Then she saw him. Garrett Boone sat by the fire, his rifle propped against the wall within easy reach. He hadn't changed from the night before, his coat still damp from snow, his boots leaving melted puddles on the wooden floor. He was whittling a piece of wood, his movements slow and methodical. She swallowed hard, memories crashing back. The chase. The gunshots. The stranger who had saved her. "You're awake," he said without looking up. Eleanor shifted beneath the blanket, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt. "Where am I?" "My cabin." Her throat was dry. "Why?" "Because you would have frozen to death otherwise." He set his carving aside and finally met her gaze. "Who were they?" The question struck like a hammer. She looked away, fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. Boone didn't press her. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackling of the fire. "You got a name?" She hesitated. Then, softly, "Eleanor." A nod. Boone! I know, she whispered. That made him pause. His eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something crossing his face. Curiosity, maybe. Or warning. You should rest, he said after a moment. She wanted to protest, to say she had rested enough, but the weight of her exhaustion dragged her back into the darkness. Days passed. Eleanor was stronger now, her color returning, but Boone remained an enigma. He spoke little, his words measured and precise. He hunted before dawn, skinned his kills with practiced efficiency, and moved through the wilderness like a creature born from it. She watched him, searching for any sign of the man beneath the silence. The way he set an extra plate at the table without asking if she was hungry. How he shifted his chair just enough so she had space when she moved past him. The way his eyes flickered to the door whenever the wind howled too loud, as if expecting trouble to come knocking. She wanted to thank him. To say something. But the words never came. One evening, as she sat near the fire, he finally asked, "Who were they?" Eleanor's fingers tightened around the tin cup in her hands. She stared at the flames, watching them dance and twist. "They work for a man named Silas Crowley." Her voice was steady, but she felt the tremor beneath it. "He owns most of the land back in town. And most of the people." Boone's jaw tensed. He said nothing, just waited. "I was supposed to marry him." Silence. "Not by choice." The words felt like a confession, even though she owed him nothing. Boone exhaled slowly. "You ran." "Yes." "And they came after you." "Yes." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "They'll come again." She nodded, her throat tight. Boone studied her for a long moment, then rose to his feet. He moved to the door, checking the rifle propped against the wall. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but firm. "You can stay. For now." Eleanor stared at him. "Why?" He didn't answer. But in the firelight she thought she saw something flicker in his expression. A memory, perhaps. Or regret. And for the first time since she had stumbled into the woods, she felt something close to safe. Eleanor had never known silence could be so loud. In the days that followed, the cabin became a world of unspoken words, of lingering glances and the quiet understanding of two people caught in circumstances either had chosen. Boone was a man of few words, but in his silence, there was something steady, something solid. He moved through his routines with purpose, splitting wood at dawn, mending a saddle strap by candlelight, scanning the tree line with the eyes of a man who had seen too many things to ever be at ease. She found herself watching him. Not out of fear, not anymore, but out of curiosity. He was careful in his movements, methodical. A man who had learned that the world could take everything from you in an instant, and had decided long ago not to waste unnecessary effort on what didn't matter. But there were moments, small, fleeting, where that careful stillness cracked. Like the way his hand hesitated when he set down her plate at dinner, as if he wasn't used to sharing a table. Or how his gaze flickered toward her when she coughed, though he said nothing. One evening, she sat on the edge of the porch, wrapped in one of Boone's heavy coats, staring out at the snow-covered trees. The storm had passed, but the cold still held its grip on the land. The wind whistled through the pines, carrying the kind of quiet that felt ancient. Behind her, Boone worked on his rifle, the rhythmic scrape of a whetstone against steel the only sound between them. Finally, he spoke. "You ever use one of these?" She turned slightly. He wasn't looking at her, his attention fixed on the barrel of the gun. "No," she admitted. He nodded once, as if that was the answer he expected. "Might be time you learned." She hesitated. "I don't want to kill anyone." Boone stopped sharpening the blade. He lifted his head, met her gaze. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, studied her for a long moment before he spoke. "There's a difference between wanting to and needing to." The weight of his words settled in the space between them, and she had no answer for it. The next morning, he handed her the rifle. It was heavier than she expected, the wood smooth beneath her fingers. Boone didn't waste time with explanations. He set up a target, a piece of scrap wood wedged between two trees, then stood behind her, his voice low and even. Hold it firm. The kick'll knock you back if you're not steady. She braced herself, inhaled, pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and violent, but the bullet went wide. Boone didn't say anything. Just reached out, adjusted the way she held the rifle, then stepped back. Again. By the time the sun reached its peak, her arms ached, her fingers stiff from the cold. But her last shot hit the target dead center. Boone said nothing, but there was a flicker of approval in his gaze. That night, she lay awake, listening to the wind batter against the walls of the cabin. She thought about the gun, the way Boone had taught her without hesitation, without doubt. He didn't see her as weak. He didn't see her as helpless. She wasn't sure what to do with that. The peace didn't last. Boone spotted them first, riders on the horizon, a dark line against the snow-covered valley. He said nothing at first, just stood on the porch, arms crossed over his chest, watching them approach. But Eleanor knew. The moment she saw the way his shoulders tensed, the way his fingers twitched toward his rifle, she knew. She stepped beside him, her throat tight. "Who is it?" "Town folk," Boone muttered. The riders slowed as they neared, their horses kicking up snow. There were 5 of them, all wearing the hard expressions of men who had already made up their minds. Leading them was a man Eleanor recognized, Sheriff Emmett Graves. He reined in his horse, gaze sweeping over the cabin before landing on Boone. "Didn't think I'd find you playing house," the sheriff said, his voice even. Boone didn't react. "Didn't think you were in the habit of riding out this far unless there was trouble." Sheriff Graves glanced at Eleanor. "Seems there is." Her pulse quickened. She felt Boone shift beside her, not stepping in front of her, not shielding her, but solid and present. A silent statement. The sheriff sighed, adjusting his reins. "Boone, you know how folks are. A woman disappears, then turns up in your cabin? It ain't sittin' right with people." "She ran," Boone said flatly. "I found her. That's not how Crowley tells it." At the name, Eleanor's stomach clenched. "He says you took what was his," the sheriff continued. "Says she belongs to him." "She ain't property," Boone said, his voice dangerously calm. The sheriff nodded. "I don't disagree." His gaze flickered to Eleanor. "But the town does." The cold felt sharper, cutting through her coat, through her skin. She knew what was coming before he even said it. "They're calling it indecent," Graves went on. "A woman, alone with a man for days, no chaperone." He exhaled, shaking his head. "They want it made right." Eleanor's breath caught. "What do you mean?" The sheriff met her gaze, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression. "You marry Boone, or you go back to Crowley." Silence. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her. The world tilted, spun, and suddenly, the cold wasn't from the wind. Beside her, Boone went still. "That's not their choice to make." "I agree," the sheriff said. "But I ain't the one holdin' the torches." He looked at Eleanor again, his expression unreadable. "I can give you a day to decide." Then he turned his horse and rode away. The others followed. Eleanor stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists, her breath coming too fast. Boone said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I won't force you." She turned to him, something bitter rising in her chest. "You think that matters?" She shook her head. "They already made the choice for me." Boone's jaw tightened. He looked away, staring out over the valley, his expression carved from stone. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Would you do it?" His gaze snapped back to her. She forced herself to meet it. "Would you marry me?" Boone studied her for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different. Lower. "I don't believe in cages, Eleanor." Her throat tightened. "Neither do I." The words hung between them, a shared truth neither knew what to do with. The fire crackled behind them, the wind howled beyond the cabin walls, and the weight of what was to come settled on them both like a storm waiting to break. The night stretched long and restless. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, rattling loose shutters, whispering like a ghost between the logs. Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the knots in the wood as though they held some hidden answer. Boone sat by the fire, silent and unmoving. He hadn't spoken since she asked him if he would marry her. He hadn't needed to. The answer was in the way he looked at her, like a man staring at the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong step would send him over. She turned onto her side, the blanket rough beneath her fingers. "You don't sleep much." Boone's gaze flicked toward her, unreadable in the dim light. "Never saw much use in it." She hesitated, then asked the question she'd been avoiding. "What are we going to do?" He let out a slow breath. "That depends on what you want." What she wanted. It should have been simple. She wanted freedom. She wanted to never hear Silas Crowley's name again, to never feel the weight of someone else's decisions pressing down on her. But she also knew the town wouldn't let her have that. If she stayed, she would be forced to marry Boone. If she refused, they would drag her back to Crowley. Neither felt like a choice. Boone reached for his rifle, checking the chamber. The metallic click of the barrel locking into place sent a chill through her. "We leave," he said finally. "Tonight." Eleanor sat up, the blanket falling away from her shoulders. "Go where?" Boone stood, crossing to the window. "North. There's a trading post near the border. We get there, we can find a way farther west. Far enough no one follow." It should have filled her with hope. It should have been a relief. But instead unease curled in her stomach. "They'll come after us." Boone's jaw tensed. "Let 'em." She believed him. He wasn't afraid of them, of Crowley, of the town. But that didn't mean they wouldn't try to stop them. Still, she nodded. "All right." They packed quickly. Boone's movements were precise, methodical, wasting no time. He gave her a saddlebag and told her to fill it with what little she needed. She grabbed a few clothes, some food. The rifle he had taught her to shoot with rested beside the door. She strapped it to her back. The horses waited outside, their breath misting in the cold night air. Boone's black stallion shifted beneath the saddle, sensing the tension. Eleanor's mare, a smaller chestnut, flicked her ears but remained still as she swung onto her back. Boone mounted without a word, guiding his horse toward the darkened tree line. Eleanor followed, heart hammering against her ribs. The town was quiet in the distance, its lanterns glowing like embers. It looked peaceful. Deceptively so. They rode in silence, the only sound the crunch of hooves against frostbitten earth. The moon was high, casting long shadows, turning the world silver and black. Eleanor kept close to Boone, every rustling branch making her pulse jump. Hours passed. The deeper they went into the wilderness, the more the tension in her chest eased. Then Boone slowed. Eleanor did the same, her breath catching. Ahead, just beyond the ridge, a flicker of movement. Horses. 4, maybe 5. Waiting. A trap. Boone's body was already taut with awareness, his hand drifting toward his revolver. Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. "How did they?" "Someone told them." His voice was low, dangerous. Betrayal burned in her throat. The sheriff. He had given them a choice, made it seem like they had time. But all the while, he had sent men ahead, cutting off their escape. Boone nudged his horse closer to her. "Listen to me." His voice was calm, steady, but there was an urgency beneath it. "We can't go forward. We turn back, ride south, keep to the trees." Eleanor swallowed hard. "What if they follow?" Boone's gaze darkened. "Then we make 'em regret it." They turned their horses sharply, hooves kicking up frozen dirt. A shout rang out behind them. Then the crack of gunfire. Eleanor ducked low over her mare's neck as bullets split the air around them. Boone fired once, his shot precise. A cry of pain followed. They plunged into the trees, branches tearing at Eleanor's sleeves, the wind like knives against her skin. She could hear them giving chase, the pounding of hooves closing in. Boone led them in a sharp turn, cutting through the thick underbrush. He was trying to lose them, using the darkness and uneven terrain to their advantage. But the riders weren't giving up. Eleanor stole a glance over her shoulder. Shapes loomed in the darkness, too close. A gunshot. Her mare screamed. The animal lurched beneath her, its front legs buckling. Eleanor barely had time to react before she was thrown from the saddle. The world flipped, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. Dirt and snow burned against her skin. Distantly, she heard Boone curse. She tried to move, but pain lanced through her ribs. Footsteps. She turned her head, vision blurring. A figure loomed over her, silhouetted against the moonlight. Scarcheek. His smile was a cruel slash. End of the road, girl. Eleanor's fingers curled in the dirt. Her rifle was gone, her body too battered to fight. Scarcheek lifted his gun. Crowley wants you alive, but he didn't say in what condition. Before she could brace for the shot, a shadow moved behind him. Boone. The knife flashed in the dark. Scarcheek stiffened, a sharp gasp escaping his lips. Then he crumpled, Boone's blade buried deep in his side. Boone didn't hesitate. He grabbed Eleanor's arm, hauling her to her feet. Can you ride? Her mare lay still, dark blood staining the snow. She clenched her jaw, shoving the grief aside. I can. Boone dragged her toward his stallion, shoving her up into the saddle before swinging up behind her. More riders were coming. Boone didn't wait. He kicked the horse into a gallop, tearing through the trees. Eleanor clung to him, pain screaming through her ribs. Behind them, voices shouted, but the gunfire had stopped. Scarcheek was dead. The others weren't willing to risk more losses. Not yet. Boone didn't slow until the sky began to lighten, the first hints of dawn creeping over the mountains. Only then did he pull the horse to a stop, breathing hard. Eleanor sagged against him, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. They won't stop. Boone's grip on the reins tightened. No. She turned her head slightly, looking up at him. What do we do now? He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold calculation in his expression. Fury. Resolve. He reached for his revolver, checking the chamber before meeting her eyes again. We end this. The sky was bleeding. Morning light crept over the horizon in thin, red streaks, casting long shadows across the frostbitten land. Boone and Eleanor rode hard through the thinning trees, the air sharp with the bite of winter and the lingering scent of gunpowder. They had bought themselves a few hours, but not more. The men chasing them weren't the kind to let wounds fester without vengeance. Boone pulled his stallion to a stop atop a rocky overlook. Below them, the valley stretched wide and empty, the river cutting through it like a vein of silver. Beyond that, the trading post, a promise of safety, of escape. But it was still too far. Eleanor twisted in the saddle, her ribs screaming in protest. Behind them, dark specks moved along the tree line. The town's riders had found their trail again. She swallowed hard. They won't stop, will they? Boone's grip tightened on the reins. Not while they think they can win. Eleanor exhaled sharply, her breath turning to mist. Then we take that away from them. Boone turned toward her, his expression unreadable. She lifted her chin, ignoring the tremor in her hands. We make our stand here. Silence stretched between them. Boone's eyes, dark as storm clouds, searched hers for something, doubt, hesitation. He found none. Finally, he nodded. They moved quickly, stripping the saddle of supplies, positioning themselves behind the natural cover of the boulders. Boone laid his rifle across the rock, scanning the approaching riders with the calculating gaze of a man who had seen his share of war. Eleanor settled beside him, rifle braced against her shoulder. Her hands weren't steady, not yet, but she swallowed her fear. Boone had taught her how to shoot. She had learned. Now she would prove it. The riders slowed as they neared, their horses uneasy on the rocky ground. The sheriff was at the front, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him, Crowley's men sat stiff-backed in their saddles, their hands never straying far from their guns. Sheriff Graves lifted a hand. Boone! His voice carried across the cold air. No need for this to end in blood. Boone's response was a sharp crack of gunfire. One of the men in the back reeled, clutching his arm as he tumbled from his horse. The others reacted instantly, drawing their weapons, but Boone didn't give them a chance to think. Another shot rang out, striking the ground near their hooves, sending the horses rearing. Chaos erupted. Eleanor squeezed the trigger. The rifle's recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she didn't stop. A bullet clipped her rider's leg, sending him sprawling. Another gunshot shattered the air, this one from the sheriff's revolver. Boone shoved Eleanor down as the bullet splintered the rock beside her. "Stay low!" His voice was steel, his focus unshaken. The fight was fast and brutal. Smoke curled in the cold morning air, gunfire snapping through the valley like a thunderstorm. Boone moved like a man who had fought 100 battles, every shot precise, every movement calculated. Eleanor's breaths came quick, ragged. She forced herself to keep shooting, to push past the fear curling in her gut. One of Crowley's men dismounted, charging toward them with a knife. Her hand steadied. She aimed. Fired. The man fell, his blade clattering against the rocks. Then, suddenly, silence. The remaining riders hesitated, their numbers cut, their confidence shaken. Boone rose slowly, revolver still in hand, his voice low and measured. "Leave!" Sheriff Graves' jaw tightened. His fingers flexed over his gun, but he didn't draw. He had seen the cost of pressing forward. A long moment passed. Then, he yanked his reins, turning his horse away. One by one, the others followed. Crowley wasn't among them. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears as she scanned the bodies littering the ground. Some writhed in pain, others lay still. But there was no sign of him. Boone noticed too. His expression darkened. "He's not done!" Eleanor gritted her teeth. "Then neither are we." The wind howled through the valley, carrying the scent of blood and gunpowder. Boone reloaded his revolver. "Stay close." They moved cautiously, stepping over the fallen, scanning the rocks and trees for any sign of movement. The weight of the rifle in Eleanor's hands was a strange kind of comfort now, no longer foreign, no longer a thing of fear. A crunch of gravel. Boone spun, raising his gun. Too late. Crowley lunged from the shadows, his knife flashing in the light. He crashed into Boone, driving him back against the rocks, the blade slicing through fabric, through skin. Eleanor screamed, raising her rifle, but the two men were locked together, grappling for control. Boone grunted as Crowley's fist connected with his ribs, but he didn't fall. He fought with the desperation of a man who refused to die. Crowley's knife came down again. Eleanor fired. The shot rang out, the sound shattering the world around her. Crowley staggered. His knife slipped from his fingers, clattering against stone. A dark stain bloomed across his chest. He looked at her, eyes wide, uncomprehending. Then he fell. Boone pushed him off, breathing hard. Blood dripped from a gash in his side, but he was still standing. Still alive. Eleanor's hands shook as she lowered the rifle. The rush of adrenaline faded, leaving only the hollow weight of what she had done. Boone stepped toward her, his gaze steady. "You had to." She swallowed. "I know." The sun had risen fully now, casting golden light over the valley, illuminating the bodies left behind, the blood staining the ground. The battle was over. Boone exhaled slowly. "It's done." Eleanor looked past him, toward the open land stretching ahead. Freedom. But freedom always came at a price. She turned to Boone. "What now?" His eyes softened. Not with hesitation, not with uncertainty, but with understanding. "No," he said. "We go." She nodded. And together, they rode toward the horizon, leaving behind the ghosts of the past, and the town that had tried to claim them.